They never knew that the man they called a waste of my potential would become the reason I never wasted a single day of my life. The last thing my father ever said to me in that house, the house with the 6-bedroom colonial facade and the circular driveway and the brass mailbox engraved with our family name, was that I had chosen a grease-stained future over a legacy 4 decades in the making. He said it the way he argued cases. Calm, measured, final. I was 21 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and completely certain I was making the right choice. That certainty did not make it hurt any less. Let me go back. Because the story doesn't start with the fight. It starts the way most things that matter do, quietly, without fanfare, in a way you almost miss. I grew up in Buckhead, the kind of Atlanta neighborhood where the homes have names instead of numbers, and the women at my mother's book club talked about their children's futures the way other people talked about investments. My father was a real estate attorney, not flashy, not televised, but respected in the way that quietly powerful men are respected. The kind where other men in suits stood up slightly straighter when he entered a room. My mother had given up a career in interior design when I was born, which she never said she resented, but which I suspected she did, at least a little. On the Tuesday afternoons, when the house was clean and quiet, and she had nowhere to be, I was their only child, which meant I was the entire plan. The plan was Emory for undergrad, then either law school or medicine, then a marriage to someone whose family name would complement ours at the Christmas card stage. I knew the plan the way I knew the layout of that house without ever having been told explicitly, simply by existing inside it long enough. I was pre-law at Georgia State when I met my husband. He was friends with my roommate's boyfriend, showed up at a cookout in a gray t-shirt with a small tear near the collar, and spent 45 minutes talking to me about the logistics of long-haul trucking with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserve for things they love. He was funny. He was specific. He knew things I didn't know. He asked me questions, and then actually listened to the answers. His name was Marcus. He was 24, drove regional freight routes for a distribution company, and had been certified as a diesel mechanic since he was 19. He had calluses on his hands, and a philosophy degree he'd never finished, and a dog named Freet, who slept at the foot of his bed. I knew exactly what my parents would say. I dated him anyway. For 8 months, I kept the two worlds separate. Marcus knew about my family. My family did not know about Marcus. I told myself I was protecting something fragile, giving it room to become solid before I exposed it to the cold. That was partly true. The other part was that I already knew what was coming, and I wanted more time before it arrived. How do you tell your parents something like this? How do you walk into a Sunday dinner with the good china and the cloth napkins and say, "I have met someone who makes me feel like a whole person, and he drives a truck for a living"? I did it in March. My mother set down her fork very carefully. My father asked, without looking up, what his family did. I said his father was a retired postal worker, and his mother was a school cafeteria manager in Macon. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. My father said, "You understand what you're asking us to accept." It wasn't a question. The next 4 months were a negotiation I never agreed to enter. My mother called every few days with suggestions. Had I considered that Marcus might be happy in a different field, something with more trajectory? My father mentioned once, very casually, that he had a colleague whose son was finishing his MBA at Vanderbilt. These were not subtle conversations. They were offers, dressed up as observations. Marcus never asked me to choose. He knew the shape of the situation. He said once, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside his apartment in Decatur, that he wasn't going anywhere, but he also wasn't going to be someone's test case. He said it without bitterness. I loved him more for that than for almost anything else. When I found out I was pregnant, I sat in my car in the parking lot of a CVS for 22 minutes before I started the engine. I was not devastated. I was not panicked. I was, in a way I couldn't fully explain yet, resolved. I told Marcus first. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Okay, what do we do?" And the way he said it, we settled something in me permanently. I told my parents on a Wednesday evening. My mother cried. My father did not. He asked if I had considered my options. I said I had. He asked if I understood what I was giving up. I said I was starting to think I'd never fully had it to begin with. That landed wrong. Things escalated in the way that conversations do when both sides have been holding back for too long and suddenly stop. My father said that if I continued this, the relationship, the pregnancy, all of it, I would be doing it without their support, financial or otherwise. My mother did not contradict him. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her eyes wet, and she did not contradict him. I said, "Then I guess I'll be doing it without you." I moved out that weekend. Marcus helped me carry boxes. He shook his head slowly at the size of the foyer when he came to pick me up, but he didn't say anything about it. We drove to his apartment in Decatur with my things in the bed of his truck, Freet sitting between us on the bench seat. And I did not look back at the house once. We got married 4 months later. A small ceremony at a park outside the city. His parents, his sister, 3 of my closest friends, and a judge who had a warm handshake and charged $200. My best friend, who I'd known since 7th grade, stood beside me. No one from my family came. My mother sent a card with no return address. It said she hoped I'd be happy. It was signed with her first name, not Mom. Our daughter was born in November. We named her Sable. She had Marcus's patience, and, apparently, my tendency to ask the question everyone else is thinking but won't say out loud. She was the easiest thing that had ever happened to me. The first 3 years were tight in a way that is hard to describe to people who have never had to calculate whether a car repair and a grocery run can both happen in the same week. Marcus was on the road 4 or 5 days at a time. I finished my degree online, taking 1 class a semester when I could manage it, and worked at a property management company answering phones and eventually handling lease agreements. I was not miserable. I want to be clear about that. I was tired in the bone-deep way that comes from doing a lot with not quite enough, but I was not miserable. I thought about my parents sometimes. I thought about my mother's hands on the kitchen table. I thought about my father's voice when he said, "Without our support." I thought about the brass mailbox. They never reached out. Not when Sable was born. Not at Christmas. Not when Marcus was promoted to a regional dispatch supervisor position and we bought our first house, a 3-bedroom ranch in Smyrna, that needed new gutters and a coat of paint, and that I loved unreasonably. Not once in 15 years. I stopped expecting them to. That is not the same as not feeling it. It is just a different relationship with the feeling, less sharp, more ambient, the way an old injury becomes part of the weather. Sable grew up knowing she had grandparents on Marcus's side in Macon, who sent birthday cards with too much money inside and called on Sunday afternoons. She knew she had grandparents on my side who were not in her life. She asked me about it once when she was 9. With the directness children have before they learn to soften things. I told her, "Some families don't stay together." She thought about that. She said, "That seems like their loss." I told her she was right. She seemed satisfied with that, and went back to whatever she was doing. Marcus and I built something. I say that plainly because it deserves to be said plainly. He started his own small freight brokerage when Sable was 7, operating out of our garage for the first 2 years, then a small office in Marietta. I got my real estate license at 30 and started selling residential properties. We were not wealthy, we were stable and growing and proud of the work it took to get there. Is there anything more clarifying than building a life from nothing with someone who shows up? I want you to hold that question, because it matters for what comes next. It was a Tuesday in October when I heard from her. 15 years and 2 months since I had walked out of that house in Buckhead. Sable was 16, a junior in high school, researching colleges. Marcus was at the office. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and 3 client emails I was working through when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer. I still don't know what. She said my name. I recognized her voice the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years before you can identify it. Your body already knows. My mother said, "I didn't know if you'd pick up." I said, "I almost didn't." There was a pause. She said, "Your father passed away 6 weeks ago." She said it the way you say something when you've practiced the sentence so many times it has gone flat. "I'm sorry you didn't hear sooner." I didn't know how to. I wasn't sure if. She stopped. Started again. She said she needed to talk to me. Not about the past, she said. About something practical. Something that involved me whether I wanted it to or not. I told her to say what she needed to say. She said that my father's estate was in probate, that there had been financial difficulties in the last several years, a commercial real estate investment that had gone badly, legal costs from a partnership dispute, and a tax lien that had materialized in a way she still didn't entirely understand. She said the attorneys had been going through everything, and they had found something that complicated the process. My grandfather, my father's father, had died when I was 14. He had left a portion of his estate in trust. The house in Buckhead, the one I grew up in, had been titled in a way that included me as a contingent beneficiary. My father had never revised the title, whether by oversight or intention. I was part of the chain of ownership. The estate couldn't be fully resolved without my signature. I sat very still with my coffee going cold in front of me. She said, "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to come and talk. Just talk. You can bring anyone you want." I don't want anything except to explain the situation. I asked her, "Where was all of this 15 years ago?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I made mistakes I don't expect you to excuse." I said I would think about it. I hung up. I sat at that table for a long time. I told Marcus that evening. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things about him, he hears all of it before he says anything. When I was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm next to you." I thought about Sable. I thought about the card with no return address. I thought about my father's voice without our support, and how those words had lived in me for 15 years like a splinter too deep to reach. I thought about the fact that he was gone now, and I had never spoken to him again, and that was a door that had closed in a way nothing could reopen. I thought about what my mother had sounded like on the phone. Not commanding, not measured. She had sounded old. She had sounded like someone standing in a large, empty room. My best friend, when I called her, said, "You don't owe her anything. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to go. Those are two different things." She was right, the way she usually is. I agreed to meet my mother for coffee at a neutral location, a place near my office, on my terms. I brought my best friend. I told my mother on the phone beforehand, "This is not a reconciliation, it's a conversation." She said, "I understand." She was thinner. Her hair was fully gray, which surprised me more than it should have. She was dressed the way she had always dressed, carefully, quietly expensive, but there was something diminished about her that wasn't about clothing. She stood up when I walked in, and she looked at me for a moment like she was calculating something, and then she sat back down. I sat across from her. My best friend sat beside me and said nothing, and I was grateful for the warmth of her being there. My mother laid out the situation clearly. The house had a remaining mortgage, the tax lien, and the estate debt. She was not destitute. She said she had her own savings and would be fine, but the house could not be sold, the estate could not be closed, and she was legally stuck until my portion of the title was resolved. The attorneys had given her options. I could sign a quitclaim deed, releasing my interest. I could choose to be bought out at the appraised share value, or I could contest the distribution and extend the probate process significantly. She said, "I'm not here to pressure you into any of those. I came because you deserve to hear this from me, not from a letter from an attorney." I asked why my father had never removed me from the title. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "I asked him that too, when the attorneys found it. He said he kept meaning to handle it, and never did. But I've had 6 weeks to think about it, and I don't think that's the whole truth." I said, "What do you think the whole truth is?" She said, "I think part of him never fully let go of the idea of you, even when he acted like he had." I did not respond to that. I wasn't sure I believed it, and I wasn't sure it mattered. I asked about the financial situation in more detail. How much was the lien? What was the appraised value of the property? What did resolve the estate actually mean for her practically? I asked the way I ask anything now, with specificity, without panic. She answered everything. She had the documents with her. I took photographs of the relevant pages. Before I left, I asked her one more thing. I said, "Did you ever tell him you were wrong? About me? About Marcus? About any of it?" She folded her hands on the table the same way I remembered from that Wednesday evening 15 years ago. She said, "Yes. I told him it was the worst thing we ever did. I said it to him probably 100 times in the last few years." She paused. He said he knew. She looked up at me. He never said it to you, because he didn't know how to undo 15 years of not saying it. I stood up. I said I would be in touch through her attorney. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for a few minutes. Our gutters had been replaced the previous spring, and the paint was a blue-gray we had chosen together, and the light was on in the front room where Sable was probably doing homework. I had built this. We had built this. Nobody had given it to us, and nobody could take it away. I thought about my father going through the estate documents and seeing my name on a title he had never corrected. I thought about 100 conversations he'd had with my mother that I would never know about. I thought about the fact that grief for a parent you estranged yourself from doesn't follow any recognizable rules. It is not clean. It does not resolve. It sits in the chest like weather. Over the next 2 weeks I did 3 things. First, I had Marcus's attorney review the full probate situation independently. I wanted to understand my actual position before I made any decisions. The attorney confirmed everything my mother had said. He also confirmed that my appraised share, if I chose a buyout, was not a trivial amount enough to pay off the remainder of our business loan and then some, if we chose to use it that way. Marcus and I talked about it. He said the decision was mine, not the money's. Second, I called Sable into the kitchen one evening and told her the full story for the first time, not the simplified version I had given her at 9, but the real one. She sat on the kitchen counter the way she always does, eating cereal at 8 o'clock at night, and she listened to the whole thing. When I was done, she said, "So she wants something from you after 15 years of nothing?" I said, "Yes." She thought about that. She said, "What do you want, though? Not what's fair. What do you actually want?" I didn't have an answer for her that night. Third, I requested the one thing I hadn't asked for in the coffee shop. I asked my mother, through her attorney, if there were any of my father's personal papers, letters, notes, anything that had been kept. She called me directly, instead of going through the attorneys. She said, yes. She said she had found something she thought I should have. We met again, just the 2 of us this time. At her apartment, she had already moved out of the house in Buckhead into somewhere smaller, which seemed to me like its own kind of reckoning. She handed me an envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting. She said he had written it 3 years ago and asked her to give it to me if anything happened to him. She said she almost hadn't because she was afraid of what it would do to me. She said, "I shouldn't have hesitated. I'm sorry." I didn't open the letter in front of her. I waited until I was in my car. His handwriting was exactly as I remembered it, precise, slightly compressed, the handwriting of someone who had spent decades signing documents. He wrote that he had tracked my career. He had seen my name in a local magazine's feature on rising real estate professionals 3 years earlier. He had shown it to my mother and told her, "That's our daughter." He wrote that he had driven past our house in Smyrna once, years ago, and had sat outside for several minutes before deciding he had no right to knock on the door. He wrote that Marcus had been, from every indication, exactly what I had known him to be, a man of character, and that my father's failing had been confusing character with credential. He wrote, "I was wrong. I said it to your mother, but I never found the courage to say it to you, and I am more ashamed of that than anything in my professional life, which is saying something for a man who spent 40 years in courtrooms." He asked for nothing. He explained nothing away. He just said it. I sat in the parking lot of my mother's apartment complex, and I cried in a way I had not cried since those early months after leaving, not with grief exactly, but with the specific exhaustion of something that has been held in tension for a very long time, finally releasing. I made my decisions in the week that followed, and I will tell you what they were and why. I did not take the buyout. I signed the quitclaim deed, releasing my interest in the property. I want to explain why. Because it is not the answer some people in my life expected. My best friend thought I should take the buyout. She said I had earned it, that it was rightfully mine, that 15 years of silence had already cost me more than money could measure. And she was not wrong about any of that. Marcus said, and I want to get his words right, he said, "The money would be useful and we don't need it to be okay. So, figure out what leaving it behind means to you, not what it gets you." What it got me was simpler than the money would have been. Signing that deed closed something. Holding on to it would have kept me in that house forever. Not the physical house, but the idea of it, the brass mailbox, the circular driveway, the version of a future someone else had decided for me before I was old enough to decide for myself. I didn't want a share of that house. I had never wanted what was inside it. I had wanted to be chosen. My father had written me a letter that said, 15 years too late. That in his way, he had always seen me clearly. That had to be enough. Because it was all there was. I did put one condition on the deed, which the attorneys documented. The condition was this: that my mother, before the estate closed, make a contribution in my father's name to a trade scholarship fund at a technical college in Atlanta, one that supported students pursuing certification in skilled trades. Electricians, mechanics, diesel technicians. My mother agreed without asking why. I told her why anyway. I said, because the man you dismissed 30 years ago, the one whose hands are too rough for dinner parties, he built a business and a family and a life that I am proud to be in the middle of. I said, and there are other kids who will be exactly like him, and they deserve to know that what they're doing matters. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, you're right. I don't know what my mother and I are now. We are not close. We are not estranged. She has met Sable twice, once for coffee, once at a school event she asked permission to attend, and which Sable, in her particular way, said yes to, with the careful generosity of someone who is extending a trial period and knows it. Sable came home from that event and said, she seems like someone who is trying. I said, yes, I think she is. Sable said, that's not the same as it being enough. I said, no, but it's where things start. Marcus has not met her. He has said he is in no hurry. He said, if it matters to you eventually, I'll be there. If it doesn't, that's a complete answer too. I have thought often about what it means to build a life alongside someone like that. Someone who meets the weight of things without drama. Who fixes what can be fixed and lets go of what can't. Whose hands, yes, still have calluses because he still gets under trucks on weekends and prefers it that way, and who has built more with those hands than most people build with every tool they've ever been given. My father said, in that letter, that he had confused character with credential. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me, including the things he said when I was standing in that kitchen with my whole life suspended between his approval and my own. Character is what stays in the room after the credentials leave. It is what shows up at 3 a.m. when the baby is sick and you are both exhausted and nobody is performing anything for anyone. It is the accumulation of small choices made consistently, without audience, over the course of years. I know what my husband is made of. I knew it at that cookout in a torn gray t-shirt, which is perhaps the only proof I need that some things can be understood before they can be explained. Sable is applying to colleges this fall. She has not decided on a direction yet, which I find completely appropriate for a 17-year-old, and which I have told her explicitly. She is considering environmental science, or architecture, or, and this is her father's influence, transportation logistics. Marcus and I have told her the same thing we have tried to live in front of her. Choose the thing you will actually do with your hands and your whole self, not the thing that looks best from the outside. She listened to that the way she listens to everything thoughtfully, with slight skepticism, which I also find completely appropriate. There is a letter in the top drawer of my nightstand. The handwriting is precise and slightly compressed. I have read it many times. I keep it not because I need it to be okay. I have been okay, but because it is true, and truth is worth keeping even when it arrives too late to change the shape of things. The house in Buckhead sold 6 months after the estate closed. I don't know who bought it or what they've done with it. I drove past it once, not on purpose. I was showing a property nearby, and I saw that someone had replaced the brass mailbox. I noticed it. I kept driving. I do not regret a single turn I took away from that driveway. I want you to remember that the next time someone tells you who you're allowed to love,